So welcome to Peter Rushen, who's the Chief Executive of Intent-Based Leadership International. Peter was previously the Chief Executive of Investors and People in Scotland, and is in the process, I believe, of moving to America to continue the development of Intent-Based Leadership International. So Peter, welcome, thanks for doing this to me. Do you mind just starting by just explaining what intent-based leadership is and why it's become your passion?
Yeah, so as you said, I was, good morning, Jim. As you said, for 15 years, I was the Chief Executive of Investors and People in Scotland. And in that role, what we were interested in was identifying and setting and accrediting good practice in how organizations led and developed their people. And along the way, I think I became frustrated about why were we not seeing big differences in terms and changes and improvements or sustained improvements in how organizations and how leaders operate. And I was reflecting to myself, I was trying my best to do everything that I thought a good leader should do. And I saw short-term impact, but after about maybe 6 months, I knew that things had dipped and I'd need to pick up again. And then somebody handed me a book called Turn the Ship Around by David Marquet. David was the former captain of a nuclear submarine, and his story was incredibly compelling. A story of change about turning the worst performing submarine in the US Navy into the best performing submarine in the US Navy, not by just being another leader who inspired and motivated people, but actually by doing the one thing that seems counterintuitive to our whole sense of leadership, which is not giving any orders. And when I read it, don't give any orders, but surely that's what leaders do. And what he created was an environment where by working with intent, so people stating their intent, this is what I intend to do, he created real ownership, real accountability, and shifted the thinking from being always with the leader or the captain of the submarine, that the thinking shifted into the crew. So intent-based leadership is a method and an approach for creating thinking, ownership, and self-accountability in organizations. And it breaks the traditional idea that we have leaders and we have followers.
Can people learn leadership then using this model? Is that something that can be taught?
Well, that's a great question. So I've spent many occasions sitting in workshop rooms with flip charts on the wall of well-meaning statements about what we want to do. And that, I think, was all focused about, you've got to change your mindset. Now, we believe that there's got to be a different way, that if you want to change or develop the way in which you lead, you've got to actually practice it. So rather than thinking our way to new action, which is all about changing mindset, and then assuming that that will change your behavior, our approach is to say, you've got to act your way to new thinking. Now, how do you do that? Well, you focus on, it's a bit like learning a new language or learning a sport. You take something and you practice and you see what happens. So for example, a very, very simple idea that it comes with intent-based leadership is you don't share your opinion until you've heard from other people. So the leader speaks last. It's very simple, but amazingly how few people actually practice it. So we might say, right, for the next month, we want you to experiment in not giving your opinion and instead inviting perspectives from around the room and see what happens. And when we practice, it can be hard, but if we see the results, then we're more inclined to try that again. And oh yeah, well, what I notice now is that people are talking about things that I'd never considered, or I've now got a much better sense of somebody's competence to be able to do the job because I haven't been doing the talking. So you as we say, act your way to new thinking by practicing small changes in what you say and when you say it.
One of the videos that I was watching on your company's website, which I would recommend people go and look at, Intent-Based Leadership International, and we'll make those details obviously available on the page, was about running meetings. And you're kind of speaking to that now. One of the things that you mentioned there when you're talking about in the context of leaders speaking last and running a meeting, where you've not want to give an opinion and you want other people to give an opinion. Do you think in a legal practice that might be a little bit more tricky than in other areas potentially?
Well, that's a good question. As an outsider and somebody engages with law firms from a professional perspective, I'm interested in opinion. Now, is there an absolute right or wrong in any situation? Not sure. But I think when I put it into the context of a legal situation, the value for me is if I'm a partner, for example, asking that question, by waiting to hear from other people in the room, what it's giving me is a sense of what's the capability in the room? What do they know that I might know, or what do they know that I don't know? So as a very least, even if at the end of the conversation, we end up in agreement, yeah, okay, we can all see the same thing. If you share your opinion first, you don't know that. You're closing down the opportunity to learn what's the capability of my colleagues and the team that I'm working with. So I think in most situations, this idea of holding back from sharing your opinion is effective. And I put it down to two things. Sometimes, let's say in an operational context, there might be just a very fixed process that needs to be followed, but we still want people to engage with the process and to think about the process. So that might be about when would be the right time to start this, even if the process is not going to change. And sometimes there'll be variation. Well, what do the different options look like? And I think my final observation in this context is just asking the question along the lines of, what is it that you might be able to see that I can't see? Again, actually, fundamentally, I think reduces the risk that organizations and teams get into in terms of making assumptions and not challenging those assumptions.
Talking of making assumptions, quite often we've perceived a little bit that it's not uncommon for people who need training the most to think that they need it the least. What barriers do you see most commonly that people put up? Getting out of the way, letting go, or others? What barriers do you see leaders putting up?
The number one barrier is time. So what that sounds like is, yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah, I can see how this could be really useful. But the reality is I don't have time to do this. But there is effectively something of a conundrum in there which says, well, if you take the time now, actually in the future, your job and the time pressure for you will change. So if you're somebody who feels that you have to spend a lot of your time with the head in the detail because you're making the decisions and you always have to be right, then you never have time to look at the bigger picture. So for me, the challenge in terms of time is, what are you prepared to invest now and what return does that bring? Because in stepping back, what you're giving people the opportunity to do is to develop their own thinking, to develop their capability, so they're capable of stepping up and making decisions that previously you might need to make. So I think that's the number one block. I think there's another aspect which plays in, particularly when we're thinking about organizations where there's kind of an established hierarchy. And that is, look, I've spent X number of years working my way up to this position. And now you're telling me that I need to do something different as a leader? Well, I'm not sure that I'm comfortable with that. I quite like being the leader and I quite like telling people what to do. I quite like making the decisions. But what you're suggesting now is a different type of leadership. And am I ready to do that?
So I've heard you speak before about people's ego getting in the way. And I think we've no doubt, and I would very much include myself in this, we've all been guilty of that at times, letting our ego get in the way. Is that something that you think needs people to be mindful of?
Yeah, of course. I'm not saying it's easy, and we are doing some work on that with a book coming out next year around the impact of ego on decision making. I think that sits with this sense of self-awareness around what's influencing the decision that I'm making at the moment, and how far is my ego driving me towards protecting my position or protecting my reputation. Here's a very, very simple example that we see prevalent in a number of organizations or within certain approaches that leaders take. And it's when somebody makes a decision and then feels that they really have to stick to that decision, and they double down on it and treble down on it, right? So we call this the escalation of commitment. So I make a decision and somebody challenges it, and my ego says, well, hold on, I must be right. So I'm doubling down to say, no, the reason that I'm right is X, Y, and Z. And then I might be asked another question. And all of these questions might be legitimate, but what gets in the way is my ego saying, but if I kind of open up and say, well, maybe you're right, it suggests that I was wrong in the first instance. I'm a leader. How can I be wrong? I've worked my way up to this position, and surely what people need in leaders is certainty. So this idea, or the challenge around escalation of commitment, that we double down on our decisions and we don't open up for the possibility which says, Joe, maybe we got that wrong, I think is something which is really difficult, but really important that we're aware of.
And should you be asking yourself that question of maybe we need to look at that again, maybe we got that wrong, of long-term things, short-term things?
I think it's both. And actually, it goes back to what we were talking about in terms of meetings and decision making. So first of all, I think organizations, teams sometimes get into a situation where they struggle to make decisions because they feel they have to have everybody on board. I would reflect that that's definitely a trap I fell into. So rather than trying to change people's minds, what we should be asking for is a commitment to action, to say, okay, so we need to make a decision. So this is the action that we're going to take, but we're going to review this. We're going to set a point of review, and that could be within 2 weeks or 2 months, depending on what we're doing. And at that point, we're going to test our assumptions. So it makes it easier to make decisions, acknowledging that people have got different perspectives. But the key thing here is we build in those points of review, which says, when would it be right to test whether the decision that we've just made still holds and is still correct? And that depends on the length of the project. So it could be both short-term, but it could hold in terms of a long-term project as well. I was doing some work with a client in the US recently, and we were talking about this, and somebody said, oh, well, we have an annual review to review whether our assumptions are correct. That feels too long. What you want to build in these reviews, so we've got the opportunity to say what might have changed, what could be different. And a good example of this, if you've watched the recent documentary on Netflix about Boeing and the 737 MAX project, if you listen to what people were saying around the concerns that they had about what they were seeing and the potential risks, if Boeing had built in those stages of saying, what are we hearing now that might change our assumptions, particularly about when we're going to deliver this product, arguably they may have taken a different course and wouldn't have ended with such a catastrophic outcome.
Right, so building in regular reviews, just keeping an open mind just by doing that is the important thing.
Yeah, we call this, we think there are two types of work broadly. There is what we call red work, which is the work which is about getting things done and getting things executed. So it's about producing things. And it's really, I think, largely what we face on a day-to-day basis. And it's incredibly important work. No business can exist without it. But it's the outputs that we produce. And then there's the blue work. And blue work is the point in which we move into making decisions and evaluating and making improvements and getting feedback. And what we observe is that lots of organizations get trapped in the delivery and get trapped in the doing. They're driven by priorities. It might be, we've got to deliver this for a customer, or we've got to deliver this for the shareholders. and they don't build in that pauses of blue work to say, what is it that we're learning? What might be different to that which we assumed, and where might we want to improve? And I think particularly in the current environment, we see lots of organizations just getting sucked in. We've just got to get it done. We've just got to get it done. And I think probably certainly the pandemic reinforced that. So lots of organizations and teams sitting on Zoom calls. And what you heard was things like, good news, everybody, this meeting is going to be shorter than we thought, and we're going to give you some time back, because everybody was having a sense of just going from one thing to the next thing for the next thing. And so those meetings generally were focused on just reporting and what are people doing, not how can we improve, what are we learning, what do we want to do differently.
You mentioned the pandemic there and the change that it's brought about. What changes have you seen that have accelerated, and what changes should people be mindful of? Because you're obviously talking there about behaviors and culture. So these can sometimes be quite hard things to put your finger on. So, but what can you put your finger on and say that is something that is definitely been evolving faster than it would otherwise?
I mean, I guess everybody knows that something which people said you can only do this over a period of time happened overnight. So that probably teaches us something about change in organizations. I think that the thing that is probably of most relevance now is, so we've been through this, what do we do next? We're faced with a situation where people are saying, well, I want to work from home. And then others saying, but it's really important that we work together. And how do we resolve that conundrum? It goes back to what I was just talking about in terms of that idea of different types of work. So if the red work is about getting things done, where that can be done and there isn't a reliance on have to work and have regular interactions with somebody else, then we see that being the opportunity. Well, that's maybe the work that we do at home. The blue work is about the quality, about the conversations, about the debates, the discussions, and the decision making. And we think that that's the point where you want to bring people together. And if you do that, continue to do that online, I think the risk is we reduce and we compromise the quality of discussion.
Okay.
I think there's nothing like being able to see and react to how people are responding in a room from a leader's perspective, that really the kind of one-dimensional approach with doing things online just doesn't give you. You've got to be able to read the room. And I think you've got to be able to take it out of the clock's ticking down here. Let's move on to the next subject.